I think that is time. Alrighty. If everyone is ready, my 7 minutes will start now. Hello, my name is Nueva, and I'm the first speaker in the affirmation for the resolution DNA evidence testing ought to be mandatory in all capital cases where DNA evidence is available. We can see the word ought in the resolution implies some sort of moral obligation, meaning that this is a value round. That essentially means that we're deciding whether or not this is a moral thing to do. That means the affirmative does not need to provide a plan text, but does need to provide a value and a value criterion. We say that our value is morality, and the value criterion, essentially the way we assess how much morality we have achieved, is going to be justice. In the context of this round, that's going to mean the correct verdict is brought in a sort of capital case. Are the innocent people being let go or being wrongfully convicted? Are the people who are actually guilty being let go or actually being convicted? We can also give a brief definition that capital cases are cases that if the defendant is found guilty, they will face the death penalty. So this is the most serious, sort of highest level of court case, and it's really important that the decisions are accurate because of the fact that those decisions could lead to the death of a person. We can also see that when DNA evidence is used in court, it's not used as the sort of sole piece of evidence or sole aspect of the story. It's usually only a part of the entire case. So let's get into our advantages as to why it ought to be used. First, that DNA evidence is incredibly reliable. The first point here is that DNA testing is 99% accurate, which is far more than any other forensic test used. For example, bite mark science was found not to be rooted in any science at all and woefully inaccurate, while false eyewitness statements lead to 50% of wrong convictions. Essentially, we can see the other methods that are used as evidence in courts aren't super accurate. The second thing we can see is that part of the reason why DNA is so accurate is because it's unique to the person. Unless you're like an identical twin, no one else on the entire planet has the same DNA as you. So it's a really good identifying factor. Even if DNA evidence is incomplete and you don't get a full sort of DNA profile, you can still pick up on certain key traits that can help you determine whether or not the suspect you think committed the crime actually did. For example, if DNA evidence shows that your suspect has orange hair, but your suspect has brown hair, that's pretty convincing evidence that your suspect is innocent. Third is we can see that DNA testing is already being used in courts. And as of 2011, 273 people, including 18 people on death row who were committed in these capital cases, have been exonerated or proven innocent through the use of DNA tests, one of which was only 5 days away from their execution. What this shows us is that DNA testing is a really good thing in terms of proving people innocent and ensuring that we don't put the wrong people in prison. We can also give a couple examples of when DNA testing has been used to prove people innocent. One is after a false confession and a death sentencing, DNA tests prove that the defendant, Frank Lee Smith, did not actually commit this crime. However, he was not released from prison until 2000, after he had spent 16 years in prison. If their DNA test had been ordered during the court case or had been ordered earlier, he would not have had to spend so much time in prison. We can see another case where a man was convicted of child rape and murder, but he died on death row. The sad thing is, 10 months later, DNA results came back, proving him innocent. However, if this had been mandatory at the start, he could have lived and survived. Essentially, what we see here with DNA evidence is that it helps increase justice because it is a reliable piece of evidence. It's better than the current mechanisms, saves lives when it has been used, and helps prevent wrongful convictions. We can also see the usage of DNA evidence in capital cases before a victim is sentenced means that people who are innocent don't have to unfairly spend time in prison where they can't see their families and they can't access resources. The next advantage is going to be that the DNA evidence is objective. The first point here is that the fact that DNA evidence is objective helps check back against public defenders who are very overworked and don't have enough.
Are we all back?
Oh, did someone drop off? I'm pausing time.
Sorry, the speech started. We're 4 minutes into the speech.
Hey guys, what's going on?
Hey,
Can you not hear me?
No, we can hear you.
We thought you were here. We're midway.
Hello?
Hello, can you hear us? I think you're,
Sorry, I think you might have your volume down.
can you hear us now?
Hello? Guys,
Yeah, we're here. Can you hear us?
can't hear you. Ah, crap. Do you have your iPad keyboard?
Same.
Can you hear us now? Hello, can you hear us now? Can you hear us now?
No.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't know what
Okay.
happened.
So we thought that you were here, so we started the speech. We were about 4 minutes in. Should we restart or?
I think I should. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I think y'all should restart. I don't mind at all.
Okay, if everyone's okay with,
It's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
alrighty. In that case, my 7 minutes will start now. Hello, my name is Nueva, and I'm the first speaker on the affirmation for the resolution DNA evidence ought to be mandatory in all capital cases where DNA evidence is available. Some brief resolutional analysis, we can see the word ought in the resolution implies some sort of value or morality, which means that this is a value round. That means the affirmation does not need to give a plain text, but does need to give a value and a value criterion. Our value, or what we should be prioritizing in this round, is going to be morality, and our value criterion, or the way we're going to determine how moral each side's arguments are, is going to be through justice. In the context of this resolution, we can see that this means getting the right verdict on a case, whether that means an innocent person is found as innocent, or whether they're incorrectly convicted, or whether the person who is guilty is actually guilty or being let go. So let's give a definition. We can see that capital cases are cases that if the defendant is guilty, they will face the death penalty. This is the most serious case that it possibly could be, and so it's really important that we have the most reliable and thorough evidence available in all of this. We can also see that when DNA evidence is being used in court, it's only a piece of the puzzle. It's not making up the entire case. Ultimately, it's just unjust to not use the evidence available to us to ensure that the wrong people aren't sentenced to death. We also see that DNA is mostly used to exonerate or prove people innocent rather than 100% show that someone is guilty. So that brings us to the first advantage, which is that DNA testing is incredibly reliable. The first point here is that DNA testing is 99% accurate, which is far more accurate than any other forensic test used. We can see that bite marks in the past have been used, but they're completely unfounded scientifically, and that false eyewitness accounts lead to 1/2 of wrongful convictions. Essentially, DNA testing is the most reliable tool we have. Secondly, part of the reason why DNA is so useful is because it's unique to the person. No one else, unless you maybe have an identical twin, is going to have the exact same DNA as you, meaning that it's a really good identifier and a really good exonerator. Even if the DNA evidence isn't fully complete and you don't have the full profile of the person, you can still identify some traits that can be used to determine whether or not your suspect actually committed the crime. For example, if the DNA evidence shows that the criminal had orange hair, but your suspect has brown hair, that's pretty good evidence that your suspect is innocent. Third is that yeah.
Couldn't this go both ways though? If your suspect had brown hair and your individual had brown hair, couldn't that also be used to falsely prove that the suspect is guilty?
It's not necessarily falsely proved because again, DNA evidence is only part of the story. And we also tell you that it's not just your hair color, there's more information than that. And that DNA evidence is usually not used as the defining factor of guilt, but rather as a defining factor of innocence. Third, we can see that DNA evidence is already being used. And as of 2011, 273 people, including 18 people on death row, essentially who are convicted in capital cases, have been exonerated or proven innocent by the use of DNA tests, one of whom was only 5 days away from their execution. We can see that the usage of DNA tests has been shown to find innocent people and save them from being killed or spending unnecessary time in prison. Had they been used at the beginning of the case before the sentencing, it would have been a better quality of life and for justice. We can also give a few examples here. The first is that Frank Lee Smith, after false confession and death sentencing, DNA tests proved that he was not the criminal, but he wasn't released into 2000 after 16 years of him being in prison. Had DNA evidence been ordered in that court, he would not have to spend 16 years suffering in prison away from his family, unable to help support them. Another example is of a man who was convicted of child rape and murder, who died on death row, but 10 months later, his DNA results had proven that he was innocent. Had these DNA results been ordered at the time of the case, not after the sentencing, he could have lived. Essentially, we can see the reliability of DNA tests helps increase the justice because they're used as a reliable piece of evidence. It's better than the current evidence that we're using, and it saves lives when it has been used. It can help decrease wrongful convictions and time spent in prison. The second advantage is going to be that DNA testing is incredibly objective, and this helps check back against injustices in the criminal justice system. The first point here is that it helps check back against public defenders who are overworked and don't have enough time to spend on cases. They are often working on 200 to 300 different cases at a time and have 5 times the amount of workload they can handle. This has led to a lot of wrongful convictions simply because these defenders haven't had enough time to build up a case. We can see that only half of DNA tests confirmed guilt, which means that 50% of people who are being tried were innocent. We can see that these DNA tests would help reduce the workload of these prosecutors and decrease false convictions by giving them a solid piece of objective evidence. The second point here is it helps check back against faulty eyewitness statements. We can see that eyewitness statements are notoriously faulty, not necessarily because of any malice, just when people are see these really traumatic situations in front of them, they don't remember things very well. We can see that eyewitness misidentification is the single greatest cause of wrongful convictions and played a role in over 75 of convictions that were overturned through DNA testing. And the third place objective testing can help is in the racial bias, especially the one that occurs in capital cases. We can see the first point here is that 80% of federal capital cases seeking the death penalty involve people of color. We can also see the odds of getting the death penalty if you were Black were 38% higher than if you were white. We can also see that the odds of getting a death sentence was 3.5 times greater if the victim was white rather than Black. What this shows is that in our criminal justice system, whether intentionally or unintentionally, there's a lot of racial bias being used, specifically in capital cases where the defendant, if found guilty, would be killed. We can see the use of DNA testing here would provide strong evidence to ensure that these people are not actually being unfairly tried and put to death. Essentially, we can see this objective has 2 impacts. One, in the cases of mistaken eyewitnesses and overworked prosecutors, it helps decreasing false convictions and provides a good defense. It helps lighten the load and strengthens the cases and checks back against witness error. And the second impact is checking back against racial bias. We can say that a DNA test ensures the suspect is actually guilty with hard scientific facts, ensuring that racism, whether intentional or unintentional, will not take the lives of innocent people. Ultimately, DNA is just another piece of evidence. Law enforcement is morally obligated to explore all angles to reveal the evidence of who is innocent and who is guilty. And that is why you must vote affirmative. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so if everyone can hear me, Just like quick introduction before I begin. My name is Josh Marveliski. I will be the leader of opposition. So since the opponents didn't really do an off-time roadmap, we won't do that either. So with that being said, I will begin my time in 3, 2, 1. All right, Judge. So I'm going to be doing a few things for you today. The first thing that I'm going to be doing is just making some quick clarifications, making sure everything's clear in this case. Then I will be providing you with our own case before their case. My reasoning for this being that we think that there is a crucial part of this case that has not really been paid much attention to and is like essential to the motion. And that is our first contention, be providing you with the rest of their contentions and moving on to their case. It's just like kind of like debunking everything that they said. So with that being said, let's get started. So ultimately, our case, we have a burden here. Our burden is to prove that the harms of implementing DNA evidence in each and every capital case outweighs the harms of not implementing it in each and every case. Now, one thing that I clearly stressed there is that the motion states that DNA evidence testing ought to be mandatory in all capital cases. So therefore, that would mean that it must be implemented in each and every single capital case. Now, why is this important? That's where we get to our first contention. Our first contention states that Sure.
Given that the resolution says DNA evidence at testing ought to be mandatory in all capital cases where DNA evidence is available, does this change your?
No, I will explain why that's kind of irrelevant. Also, was that like whatever? Okay. So our first contention is that if DNA evidence is useful, it will be used by the prosecution or the defense in either world. So therefore, making it mandatory will only make it used in situations in which it is not necessary. So that's kind of a long sentence. Let me explain exactly what that means. So in the status quo, this is kind of a simple logical argument. In the status quo, there are two sides, the prosecution and the defense. This is how it works for capital cases. Both of these sides, the prosecution and the defense, are vying to get their win. The prosecution wants to prove that the person on trial is guilty, and the defense wants to prove that they are innocent. Therefore, we argue that if there is DNA evidence available to prove each side's case, if there's DNA evidence exonerating someone of their crimes, or if there's DNA evidence pinning someone as guilty, that will be used. And it is used in the status quo. We tell you that since both sides' goal here is victory, since both sides' goal is either reaching an innocent or guilty verdict, if DNA evidence proves such a verdict, it will be used in the status quo and is actively being used in the status quo. With this, we can assume that any DNA evidence that proves innocent or guilt will currently be used, and therefore, in the status quo, usage of DNA evidence when useful is necessary and will occur. So that raises the question, what is the other side actually arguing for if it's already being used when it is useful? Well, they're trying to make it, they're arguing that it must be implemented in situations in which it is useless. Ultimately, there are many detriments to this that aren't logical. I've just shown you why both sides, yes.
Can you give an example of where DNA testing, just exploring all options, is bad or useless?
Okay, I would love to give an example. The police show up on scene and get a video recording of some guy stabbing their, victim. They have a recording of it happening, see it happening, right? Those are the types of cases in which DNA evidence is not necessarily useful. Also, I'm giving you like a simple logical argument here, which states that like in general, if it is useful, they will have explored that option. Both sides are doing everything possible to get their victory, and therefore, if it is useful, it will be used, and it is currently used. Ultimately, what they're vying for is like what the other side is trying to achieve is having these DNA tests used in capital cases where it is clearly unnecessary for it to be used. What is the impact of this? We give you a few. A, cost. Implementing mandatory DNA testing in all capital cases is going to lead to like kind of like the bureaucratic inefficiency that we currently see. The average cost of DNA testing is approximately $1,000. Now, as the op, we fully agree that like if you can prove that this significant additional government spending was useful, fine. And we argue that its usage in these cases where it could actually have an impact is useful. But when it's completely useless, and that's the reason why it wouldn't already be presented in the status quo by the prosecution or the defense, then you're going to be spending unnecessary government spending for no reason or unnecessary spending for no reason. Therefore, it makes absolutely no sense to force its implementation. So, with that being said, let's move on to the second contention, which is about violating the presumption of innocence. Our fifth, 6th, and 14th Amendment have this basic idea. they were like kind of extend themselves and they shine upon this idea of guilt of innocent until proven guilty. The fundamental idea, just the theoretical idea of mandating DNA evidence is ultimately assuming guilt and therefore hunting DNA evidence even in situations in which guilt is not necessarily guaranteed. And this is an absolute violation of this idea. Now, when you go to the status quo in which it is optional, only useful to the case. No, thank you. I'm almost out of time, so I want to keep moving. But we tell you that in the status quo, when it is optional, it's not a violation of the Constitution because you can only use it when it is, useful. However, when you're mandating it in all situations, we believe that this is just a blatant contradiction of the Constitution, and therefore simply off that value should not be allowed. The reason this is intrinsic to mandatory DNA is that it is going to be used in each and every case, and therefore is a violation of guilty or proven innocent. And now the last and most unique contentions that we pose that there's really not much of a reputation for is privacy concerns. In order for a DNA test to work, a database will be created by the police or by the government for such DNA test to be based off of. So when you begin to collect the DNA of each and every person on trial, you build a large database of DNA. What is the impact of having your DNA leak? What is the impact of these possible safety concerns? They're quite substantial. If an individual's DNA is leaked in a data breach, it can be used for a variety of malicious purposes. For example, it can be used to create like fake identities or fake bank accounts for identity theft. It can be sold in the dark web to criminal organizations. It can also be used by like employers or insurance companies to kind of like discriminate against individuals. For example, what if you find out you're like predisposed to a health condition through DNA testing and through DNA information, and now these healthcare companies don't even want to provide service to you? You can see all the detriments of having this leak. So now we prove to you these three unique contentions. Now, how will I prove to you that their cases don't work? So, firstly, they give like this clarification of only weighing on morals, and we fundamentally disagree with this weighing mechanism. So we're going to provide a counter framework, and that is basic net benefit. We agree that one of our priorities should be a correct verdict, but this does not exist in a vacuum, and therefore we must look at impacts such as cost that we presented to you with regards to the country as a whole. With that being said, we don't disagree with their framework because we know that that is also important. However, we argue that both frameworks should be used, and we tell you that their contentions don't even make a guilty verdict happen. I meant an actual true verdict happen. Now, next, we tell you that they're making a very critical misconception of the motion. The argument is about its usage in all scenarios versus its usage in the status quo, which we argue it is always used in the status quo when used. So, therefore, that doesn't make any sense. Lastly, they make a contradiction in their case saying that it's only a supplement, but yet will be enough to influence preventing minority discrimination and getting all these true verdicts, but we argue that's untrue. So now let's move on. Their first contention is that DNA evidence is incredibly reliable and accurate. We argue to redirectly contradict this and provide you with a few statistics. According to a report by the National Registry of Exonerations, DNA evidence played a role in approximately 25% of wrongful convictions that were later overturned. This suggests that while DNA is used in cases, there are still 25% of cases are wrongful exoneration. Wrongful convictions. So therefore, usage of DNA has led to significant amounts of wrongful convictions. Next, we tell you that according the genetic researchers found that approximately 1 in 16 DNA profiles generated by a private laboratory had an error in interpretation. So therefore, that goes against both their first and second contentions that DNA isn't objective and can be interpreted in different ways. But once again, we tell you that all of this is completely irrelevant. That all of this is completely irrelevant due to the fact that it is used in the status quo when useful, and all of this will only be supplemented in cases in which it is not useful. So therefore, all of our contentions stand, and all their contentions fall because we are enforcing it in all cases, which we say will not provide any value. With that, I urge a opposition ballot. Thank you.
Just to clarify, there is no grace period at this tournament, but
Really? Sorry, we're used to East Coast.
you're all good. The order is going to be an overview, top of case, affirmative case in order, and the negative case. Does that work for people? Amazing. Okay. If everyone is ready, my time will start now. Judges, the overview for today's round is that if DNA evidence is available, we must mandate that it is investigated. As a country, we cannot sit by and let DNA evidence that is available at crime scenes go untested, unstudied, unexamined, because that means that that investigators are not doing their due diligence and exploring basically all of the evidence in a trial. Judge, this is an inherent flaw in our system right now, and something that must be rectified through the affirmative plan. The second observation that I want to make is the overview. is fundamentally our examples prove to you that DNA evidence is not used in every case where it's available. Look at the two examples we gave you of where DNA evidence was basically used after this person was convicted in order to exonerate them later because there were suspicions about their case. We see that fundamentally there are a lot of people who get wrongfully convicted and who have DNA evidence available where their DNA evidence is not being used. With that, let's move into the affirmative team's top of case. We say,
POI.
I'll get to it at the end if I have time. They first tell you that there are basically the burdens of the round are to prove that there are harms in each and every case. We tell you that fundamentally the resolution tells us that we have to be looking at just where DNA evidence is available. Next, they tell you that we must be evaluating this round based on net benefits. Like, you can evaluate net benefits under the frame of justice. We tell you that the justice system exists to kind of serve out justice. So that's what we should probably be evaluating in today's round. However, let's just move into the affirmative team's case. First, they tell you that there's just a lot of wrongful convictions and DNA evidence isn't super reliable. So first is we tell you that we found the same statistic they did. That just says that 25 in this article, it just said that 25% of DNA tests may yield a wrong result, not necessarily that results in a conviction. We tell you that basically all of our methods for figuring out whether someone is guilty or innocent are very much prone to error. Eyewitness statements, again, the teeth marks that my partner told you about, and basically every single argumentative technique used in a courtroom is prone to error. But we tell you that it is still within the best interest of society to explore every sort of option. We see that we are able to form better verdicts if we have more information. Even if some of it is unreliable, it's better for us to have more information. It's better for us to not just rely on eyewitness statements, but to have that additional DNA evidence for if there's a possibility that it corroborates that story or throws question into a case where someone may be innocent. This means that even though they tell you that even if you buy that it's not super reliable, we still have a moral obligation to use it. I'll get to it at the end if I have time. Secondly, the second argument here is you're going to be extending my partner's analysis that says that DNA evidence is 99% basically reliable. We also see that fundamentally DNA testing is getting more and more accurate as we continue through basically society. In the last 30 years, it's basically become I think 50 to 100% more accurate. And we see that this is only going to continue. And third is, again, we see that although it makes a difference, we're just telling you that even though we tell you that it's just a part of cases, it's an important part. And we tell you that this can make a difference in basically court cases. And at the end of the day, Judge, we tell you that fundamentally, DNA testing, DNA testing requirements would have stopped at least 2 people from being on death row for losing basically years of their lives to the prison system. And that's probably gonna be a reason to vote for us right there. Next, on objectivity, they just tell you that we have a contradiction and that we say that, oh, it's adequate to change the results but it's only a part of the puzzle. But Judge, every piece of evidence has the potential to change the verdict of a trial. That's fundamentally how the justice system works. And given that's the only response to our complete disadvantage or advantage about objectivity and how public defenders are overworked and how more evidence makes our criminal justice system better and checks back against faulty eyewitness statements, you're just going to be buying that this is another place to vote for the affirmative. Now let's move into the negative team's case. On their first contention about how it's used in either world, I have a few responses. First is that First is we see that fundamentally our examples prove to you that this isn't the case. If the affirmative plan were to pass, or if this world were to exist, DNA testing would be mandatory once there's evidence of DNA at the scene. This would have to be used in court trials. However, we tell you that in these examples, there was DNA evidence available and it wasn't analyzed until much later. So we see that fundamentally their argument about how it's used in every case isn't true. The second argument is that the law just tells us that this isn't true. There's several states with the death penalty that don't have mandates to analyze all DNA, and especially with court systems being completely overworked, a lot of people aren't doing their due diligence to get all these samples analyzed. We also see that there are a lot of restrictions to getting DNA evidence in the status quo, which means that the affirmative team lessens those burdens. The negative team can't provide you a single, like, basically, their contextualization and evidence for this just isn't true and like isn't reliable, so you shouldn't be voting for them here. We also see that mandatory DNA testing makes evidence collection more like basically reliable. We see that without mandatory testing, DNA evidence collection may not happen or may be significantly delayed. What this mandatory what the affirmative plan does is it specifically makes this an expectation so that forensics experts are looking out for DNA on the scene. This makes, again, investigations more reliable. Next, they talk about spending. We see that fundamentally, there aren't that many death row inmates. There are only about like 100 total, but on death row actively, and there may be only like additional 10 per year. This is not a significant financial burden, and we tell you that there are a lot of other parts of criminal investigations that are much, much worse. Second here is that we see that preserving human rights and justice is going to be better. Next, they tell you that it violates the presumption of innocence. But Judge, this isn't really the case. When we looked at how the criminal justice system works, people who are arrested get their fingerprints taken. That's to match them in a system, but that doesn't mean that they're presumed guilty. We're just collecting evidence. We also see that DNA testing doesn't mean that we think that people think that you're guilty. It just means that people are collecting evidence so that we can make sure that we have the best result possible. Look to literally every investigative technique that may be considered to normally violate someone's privacy. That is something that doesn't violate any constitutional amendments. Next, they talk about privacy concerns. Judge, this is death row. People aren't like without like if they were convicted, people's data is not a concern for them. But also we see that a database doesn't exist. All this is a test. So the forensic experts send a test to the lab. They get a paper back that says, is this a match for this suspect? Is this a match for this suspect? That doesn't actually create any data breaches. Also, 23andMe already exists in the status quo. DNA data breaches are much, much worse on platforms like that. And at the end of the day, Judge, because fundamentally, the fact that our court systems do not work unless we explore all angles, you must be voting for the affirmative. Thank you.
Okay, real quick before I begin, I have quite a bit to get through so that my partner can weigh properly. Does anyone mind if I speak quickly? Okay, cool. With that said, before I begin, hi, I'm Mo Pasha. I go by they them, and I'm going to be your MO for this speech. Alright, I'll begin my time in 3, 2. Where I lied, my timer is off. I'll begin my time in 3, 2, 1, begin. Okay, so to give you a quick roadmap for how my speech is going to be broken down. Firstly, I'm going to be providing a roadmap. Firstly, I'm going to be providing like a line by line on virtually everything they've said. Then after that, I'm going to be introducing the major voting issues for this round. Okay, cool. Let's jump straight in, right? Okay, their first contention is this idea that DNA is reliable. However, and that it's the most accurate form of forensic testing, but this falls victim to human error. It is a unique flaw to their side that DNA testing is going to be mandatory, and that all of that human error is going to be exacerbated on their side because they uniquely allow for more instances of human error to pop up. Now then, talking about another sub-contention of their first contention, the false confession example, right? But the fact of the matter is that even if DNA evidence existed, and even if DNA evidence was brought up in that case, the person who gave a false confession would still be sentenced to death because they gave a false confession. The fact of the matter is that a confession is directly going to lead to capital punishment in capital punishment cases. So DNA in that instance just does not matter. Okay, now then, let's talk about their second contention, which is DNA is objective, right? So in that contention, they talk about how defenders don't have time to build up a case, so DNA can be used to supplement, but this contention concedes the fact that prosecutors are going to use DNA as a sizable amount of the case, and when DNA is used as a sizable part of the case, it leads to more false...
Why?
No, thank you. it leads to more false evidence being used for these people and more people being falsely convicted. Now, the third contention about racial profiling, right? They talk about how this can be used to fight against false eyewitness accounts, but that this again can create a double bind on their case. They present this narrative to you, Judge, that DNA is both a tool for cases and isn't an absolute, but also is a holy grail that can be used to solve people when they're falsely convicted and in cases of racism within the legal system. The fact of the matter is that it is a one or the other scenario. They cannot have their cake and eat it at the same time. They can either choose to flow through the impact of it being non-absolute, or they can flow through the impact of helping people sometimes. Now then, let's talk about a couple other things, right? So they talk about how all methods for deciding guilt are subject to error, but I think again this should just be a wash. DNA is flawed. All other forms of testimony are also flawed, so that doesn't go to either side. There's another thing is that they said DNA testing becomes more and more accurate. Judge, does that mean that we should make it mandatory as of now? Does that mean that we should sacrifice the people of the present so that those in the future can have more accurate DNA testing? Should we be sacrificing our morals and our grounds as an American people just because we will be getting more accurate results in the future? Next, they talk about how it's a part, but an important part of investigations. But then they further go on to talk about how the legal system is clogged up and public defenders are busy, so they can't utilize this to the maximum capacity. Again, take one or the other, Judge. They cannot have both. They cannot free up the legal system and also only have DNA being a small part, because they fundamentally are pushing the narrative that DNA will be such a massive part that it'll unclog the whole legal system, right? Now then, and then additionally, they say that, oh, it'll save at least 2 people. But again, we say in our first contention that we are going to be incriminating many, many more. Now then, the next thing that they spoke about was objectivity, but and they say that every piece of evidence has the power to change the outcome of a trial. But again, this is either a wash for them or a point that flows over to our side, because we are saying that this DNA, when used in non-applicable cases, will lead to the outcome of the trial being changed for the worse. It'll lead to more people being punished and being incriminated, even though it it wasn't their fault and they are not guilty. Now then, a couple more. Stick with me, Judge. Thank you for your patience and flowing. Okay, next. Mandatory DNA testing makes DNA testing more reliable and will take longer and force an investigation to. This is for a second on accident. Will lead to an investigation being longer and forensics being used more, right? But again, this falls victim to the fact that they are forcing even more levels of bureaucracy. Judge, no, thank you. Okay, so on top of the fact that they're saying that we are going to be doing this for all cases where DNA is available, that just means that we're adding bureaucracy to this picture. The fastest way and the most just way to deliver justice to those who are on death row and those who are in cases of capital punishment is not to add bureaucracy and not to slow down the court process, but rather to do things the most efficient way and the most just way. Now then, the final thing that I want to talk about is spending and the presumption of justice, right? They say that, oh, only 100 inmates total are going to be there, right? And it's not a burden when it comes to cost. It's worth it to preserve human rights, right? But fundamentally, this is wrong, because there's over like 16,000 cases, capital cases brought to trial every single year. So they grossly underestimate this. But in addition, they also present this narrative in which it's okay to cost the state money and it's okay to waste the public's taxes just for the sake of getting more evidence, even when it's not needed and even when it's not necessary. Now then, let's additionally talk about presumption of justice. They say that DNA evidence doesn't mean that you're guilty, but it can be used. But here's why that's just straight out false. Judge, if you start out and if you have a cookie jar on your table and you tell your kids, hey, don't eat the cookies, right? And then magically a cookie disappears. If you start out with a presumption that one kid took the cookie and you search for evidence that this child took the cookie, you will find it. The fact of the matter is that by them using DNA evidence in all situations, they are becoming victims to hindsight bias and are basing their entire case on the pillars of salt and sand that are hindsight bias in the court system. The final thing that I want to talk about is death row privacy, right? They say that, oh, this is death row. It doesn't matter whether they have privacy or not, Judge. But which side really upholds human rights here? Which side preserves the dignity of people that are being put on capital cases? Do you think it's the side that just minimizes these data leaks and says, oh, but things like 23andMe exist? But it's their side that is worse, Judge. We are advocating for the rights and the dignity of prisoners, and they are minimizing it and frankly infantilizing prisoners by saying that, oh, their data leak, it doesn't matter. And additionally, they're saying that there won't be a database, but that has to happen. You have to store the data somewhere for capital punishments. Okay, now then, I'm gonna talk about, now I'm gonna introduce the voting issues for this round that my partner is gonna talk about. The major voting issues that my partner is going to be weighing on is number one, which side preserves the most justice, and number two, which side is the one that works in reality, and which side is the one that is right. So which side is right? Thank you, and I hope you cast an oppositional ballot.
Okay,
I apologize for not taking your POIs. I had a lot written.
All good.
so with that being said, if everyone is ready, I will begin my time in 3, 2, 1. All right, Judge, I'm just going to jump right in and discuss the main voting issues of this round, and I have 4 for you. First, the reliability of DNA testing. Secondly, privacy concerns, kind of testing were kind of a drop point. Third, violation, like the violation of like the presumption of innocence. And lastly, like its current usage and the impact, kind of our first contention, is essentially what I'm saying. So with that being said, let's jump in. As far as the reliability of the DNA testing, we provided you with like the 25% inaccuracy in DNA test statistics. We provided you with the fact that there are 1 in 16 misinterpretations of DNA. So they gave 2 responses to all of these like inaccuracies that we pointed out and how it's actually not as accurate as they say it is. They say, first of all, it'll get better over time. But we asked you, so why are we implementing now? Thank you for conceding the fact that its implementation right now is ultimately going to be harmful and inaccurate. So in that case, that response completely drops. Secondly, the fact that like there's not enough cases that happen each year for it to actually make a difference. And that was kind of like a weird response. I'm not really sure if I misunderstood that response, but that's what I got from it. And this is just ultimately untrue. An estimated 16,661 reported murders and non-negligent manslaughter cases occurred in the United States in 2019 alone. So there actually are many capital cases. There's just not that many death penalties that ultimately end up occurring. So what does this point go to? The fact that we have the most reliability on our side and therefore the most justice. We are stating that the lack of usage, or at least like a little bit less usage of this inaccurate system is at best for their side a wash. So we think that the reliability of DNA testing can just be, kind of stricken off your ballot ultimately, because we think that we provided you with inaccuracies, they provided you with accuracies. Ultimately, we think it's a wash. So moving on to the next thing, privacy concerns, they give you 1 response. They say, no database is actually being built up. And as my partner just stated, this is a clean lie. The FBI's combined DNA index system contained over 14 million offender profiles off of DNA testing and more than 3 million forensic profiles, making it the largest database in the world, actually. So that point on there being no database is the furthest it could possibly be from the truth. And this goes to both frameworks. A, justice, as we are providing what is best for those on death row, and B, simple utilitarianism, that benefit as it belongs towards our side is privacy concerns is a pretty important concern of your average American person. So now moving on to the third one, as we have one on privacy, that one completely dropped. Third one is like violating the presumption of innocence. We heard absolutely no response to this, and I think it was sufficiently just built up by my partner. And this goes to the idea of justice and getting what is best for these prisoners and a fair verdict, and that is not presuming guilt and not violating our constitution. So therefore, going off that point flows through, conceded, unresponded. And now on to the last voting issue, that being our first contention and its current usage and the impacts of the decisions in its case. So just to re-summarize our first contention states that like, if the DNA testing will ultimately be useful to getting a guilty or innocent verdict, it will have been used. So obviously, like they respond with like, it actually isn't being used enough already. but that's a logical fallacy as in the fact that like the defense and the prosecution will be doing everything they can to receive their preferred verdict. And therefore, by saying that it isn't actually being used, therefore the only way to argue this is the argument that they end up making, saying, actually, the defense isn't doing their due diligence and they are not trying hard enough to get this person to be innocent. So making it
Point of
mandatory.
order, stop time.
Yes.
This was not, all of our points in response to your status quo solves were not responded to. And this articulation is new.
Well, they
Can
were.
you be more specific, please?
I mean, I'm just reiterating my first contention.
Yeah,
Like, this is verbatim what my first.
Okay, it's judges, there's no back and forth, the judge's
Okay.
discretion. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so going back to like restating what my first contention said is the fact that like if it is useful to the prosecution or if it is useful to the defense, they will use it. So therefore, what they are stating in it not actually being used in all cases is just untrue, as my partner pointed out by reiterating our first contention. So then they give one response to saying that like public defenders aren't actually going to pursue this due to a lack of due diligence, and we believe that this just isn't true because if they aren't following their legal duties of due diligence, then they won't follow the affirmative mandate either. So we think that point's a wash, and therefore our first contention still stands clean conceded. So with that being said, what stands and what falls? Our first, second, and third contentions all stand, and all of their contentions fall, as I've just proven in my last speech. And with that, I urge a opposition ballot in this debate. Thank you.
All right, as a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to be giving an overview, then going into the affirmative arguments, and then the negation arguments. If everyone is ready, my 5 minutes will start now. You're going to be voting for the affirmative because we are morally obligated to use all evidence available to us in a case. And this means that lives and the pursuit of justice is what you should be prioritizing in today's round. They try to tell you there's this sort of double bind. You can't have significant DNA being a significant part and DNA like being everything. We can see again, it is a puzzle piece. It is simply a part of the case, just as significant as an eyewitness statement could be or any other argument. Yes, any piece can have the potential to change the outcome of the case. So let's look to the first main issue, which is going to be that of reliability. I want to pose a question. Just because eyewitness statements are infallible, should we just remove them from all our court proceedings? No, despite the fact that eyewitness statements have led to 75% of wrongful convictions. Any test, argument, or witness statement that is used in a case as a sizable part of evidence is inevitably unreliable. But what's unique about DNA testing is that it is more reliable than the current methods. More reliable than eyewitness testing, more reliable than bite marks, more reliable than anything we're using right now. And on top of that, we've shown you how this reliable evidence has been used to prove the innocence of 18 people, stopping them from being unfairly killed for crimes they did not commit. We can see that ultimately, even if it doesn't work all of the time, it works most of the time, and it's better than what we're using already and saves lives. And that's just a vote for the affirmation right there. But on top of that, let's look to objectivity and the ability to check back against injustices in the criminal system. Our opponents try to hyperbole this and exaggerate, but we tell you ultimately this isn't going to solve all the problems with the justice system. But what it will do is make things better than they are right now, make things more just than they are right now. DNA evidence provides a valuable tool that defenders can use to build stronger cases that decrease the amount of wrongful convictions, which again, as we tell you, is really critical considering that eyewitnesses are notoriously faulty. Because these DNA tests can be used as supplements as part of the evidence, people's lives are saved. They aren't forced to spend years in prison and aren't killed for the crime of not committing anything, for the crime of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ultimately, we can see the affirmation has proven to you it is morally right and good for justice to use DNA evidence in capital cases when it is available. Even if you don't buy that this outweighs the negation, let's look as to why the negation points that they bring up aren't reasons why you should be voting for them or voting us down. The first argument they bring up is that if it's useful, it's used anyway. But we have 3 arguments as to why that is not true. 1, we tell you in the examples we give you, it was not used. That is why DNA evidence had to be used after these people were put on death row and weren't used during the case. Secondly, we also see that states don't have protections, don't have mandatory DNA testing right now, meaning that it's possible for cases not to have this testing. And third, and perhaps most critically in the pursuit of justice, we can see that if it's not mandatory, that means it takes longer to decide whether or not you use it. And that valuable time can degrade or destroy a DNA sample, meaning evidence you could have had, evidence that could have proven someone innocent, was gone because you did not have it to be mandatory. Ultimately, we can see it's good for it to be mandatory, and the status quo is not solving. The next thing they try to say is that cost is a huge reason, and we shouldn't have mandatory DNA testing. But again, I want to reiterate the fact that the percentage of capital cases is like 1% of all criminal cases. And the percentage that have available DNA evidence is even smaller. So it's not that huge of a cost. The negation gives you the number of $1,000. The negation would rather save $1,000 than save the life of a possibly innocent person. That should not be a trade-off we are making. That is incredibly immoral and not at all like helping us achieve justice in any way, shape, or form. They then try to tell you that, oh, it violates the presumption of innocence, it assumes guilt. We tell you this isn't the case. If taking any sort of personal information was given as presumption of guilt, taking fingerprints or blood samples or even imprints of your shoes would be considered as violation of guilt. We can see that's not the case, and DNA evidence is not the case, especially considering it's been used before and hasn't like been proven unconstitutional. The last concern the negation brings up is that of privacy. We tell you fingerprints are already taken. They can be used for similar nefarious means. We also see the database they bring up is for all cases and jobs that require background checks, not specifically criminal capital cases. And ultimately, we see this is ultimately just a test with results that tell you whether or not your suspect matches the DNA of the person found at the crime. At the end of the day, we can see that mandatory DNA testing in all capital cases is going to be critical in pursuing justice, as it is a vital piece of reliable evidence that helps save lives and reduce the number of wrongful convictions. And saving lives should outweigh any sort of marginal harm that may be caused. For all these reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey,
Good debate, everyone.
that was really good. And I just have one point of clarification because I missed when I couldn't hear you guys at the beginning. So Nueva, I don't know which one of you is Nora and which one is Lauren.
I'm Nora. I was the first and third speaker, and I'm Lauren.
Okay, great. All right, we'll be back.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. Good round, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, are all the debaters and the other judge here?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Great round and good job finishing off a long day of debating. This is a fun round to judge. The decision ends up being a 2-0 for the affirmative from Nueva. Anna, would you like to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
I voted for Gov, in part because of the importance of saving lives and, the idea that we should use all available evidence as being primary over the idea of saving money and the potential risk of, to privacy concerns in this case. I thought those were very strong arguments, and for example, the importance of saving lives was something that I didn't really hear you guys argue against, as far as exonerating potentially innocent victims. I do recognize that there's a bit of a conversation about whether or not DNA testing is fully accurate, but it can in fact be used to exonerate people. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Yeah, those were my main final things that flowed. I guess things that were standing at the end. And I will write up more detailed feedback for you guys in the chat room.
Yeah, my decision is like pretty much identical. I just think that like the affirmative like has a good amount of evidence that proves that even if DNA is like sometimes faulty, it's still like very accurate, and more importantly, it's just a piece of the puzzle that can be used to like exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals. I think like a larger point, and I kind of wish that the AF like hammered this a little bit more, is that like public defenders are extremely overworked, and I think that like that argument was very good and kind of got lost in like the midst of the debate, which I don't like blame you all at all for, because it was a very like complicated debate in terms of the amount of arguments that were being made on both sides. But I think like hammering that home a little bit more, because it like public defenders are extremely overworked, like just truthfully, and like that didn't play a factor into my decision, but I just think that was like a strong argument that I think y'all could have gone harder for it. But in general, I just think that like the app is winning, that they're saving lives on death row for people that are wrongfully convicted, and they're just adding more to like the evidentiary like piece of the puzzle in a case. I think that like very similarly to the other judge, just like the other impacts of like cost and like privacy were like in comparison just not as large, both under the framework of justice or net benefits, just because there's not a substantial cost to using this like evidence that is like mostly available like in these cases, like as per the resolution, but also just in general. And even then the cost is like kind of negligible, just considering like how few like capital cases there are in comparison to just like trials in general. And then I think the privacy concerns, like the arguments about how like we fingerprint people regardless and we have all these databases regardless, just like kind of makes it moot, because like if we have all these databases, then the risk would be like equally high either way. Like adding this DNA database doesn't like really do anything. And then I think this like argument about like how like using or mandating DNA evidence like violates the like presumption of innocence, like constitutionality argument, like I don't think it makes like very much sense to me. And I think that the AF like arguments kind of like end up being pretty convincing here about how like we fingerprint people regardless, like we take blood samples, like we do things like outside of like as soon as someone is arrested, just like for like safety precautions and for like just like logging data, and that doesn't like immediately mean that they are presumed to be guilty. I guess like I understand that like maybe like the magnitude of like taking a DNA sample is greater, but I think like you guys need to make that distinction for us and say why it would be like a legal issue, which I don't think it would be, because we already take DNA evidence in the status quo. So maybe you could have made it like a moral issue, or say that this will like dissuade juries to like automatically voting like anything that has DNA evidence like to be guilty, even though like sometimes DNA evidence can be wrong. And that could be an argument that you all could go for, but I don't think those arguments were ever made in the debate. And like the argument as it is constructed is just not very strong. So yeah, that's kind of why I end up voting affirmative. But yeah, good debate. If y'all have any questions or like, I'd be happy to answer.
Great.
Nope, I don't think so. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a nice rest of your evening, guys. See ya.
Good evening.
Good luck tomorrow, everyone.
Good luck, everybody.